Christmas Eve, candles were lit. The table was set for people I thought I could trust. A stranger knocked on my door, cold, soaking wet, standing in the snow, with nothing but a quiet look in his eyes, asking for nothing more than a little warmth. My son told me to send him away, firmly, without hesitation. Instead, I pulled out a chair and handed him a plate. That single decision changed everything. Because that stranger sitting at the end of my table exposed every scheme my son and daughter-in-law had spent 7 months carefully building. They paid a very heavy price for all of it. Hey, welcome to the channel. Really glad you found this story. Hit, if you're staying till the end, subscribe so the next chapter finds you. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Important disclaimer, this is a completely fictional story. All characters and events are imagined for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to actual people or situations is entirely coincidental. What this story does carry, however, is something genuinely worthwhile, a message about Patient's family and what it really means to protect the people you love. There's a particular kind of silence that lives inside a jewelry store after closing time. Not the silence of emptiness, more like the silence of things holding their breath. The display cases still glow. The stones inside them catch the last of the evening light and throw it back in colors that don't have names. I've been listening to that silence for nearly 50 years, and I still haven't gotten tired of it. My name is George Whitfield. I'm 74 years old, and I am a jeweler. Not the kind you see in mall kiosks surrounded by synthetic stones and laminated price tags. I mean a real jeweler, the kind who can hold a rough piece of corundum up to the light and tell you before any instrument confirms it whether there's a ruby worth finding inside. I learned that skill the hard way, the way most things worth knowing are learned slowly, with bad lighting and aching eyes, and a teacher who didn't believe in shortcuts. For 45 years, Whitfield Gems has sat on the corner of Northwest 13th and Glissane in Portland's Pearl District. We moved into this building before the Pearl District was the Pearl District, back when it was still warehouses and railroad tracks and men who didn't ask too many questions. The neighborhood grew up around us. The galleries came then, the restaurants, then the boutique hotels with their exposed brick and $100 cocktails. We stayed. The sign above the door has been repainted 3 times, but it's always said the same thing. These days, it's just me and Earl. Earl Hutchins has worked the front counter for 22 years. He's 68, moves a little slower than he used to, and still insists on wearing a bow tie every single day. When I asked him once why he bothered, he said, "Mister, Whitfield, the customers don't come in here to see a man who stopped trying." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. The shop is smaller than it looks from the outside. 3 display cases arranged in a U-shape, a back room, where I do my actual work, a small office that hasn't been properly organized since 2019, and a corner near the window where a wooden chair sits at a slight angle to the wall. That chair has been there for 30 years. For most of those years, it belonged to Margaret. My wife passed in the spring of 2022, pancreatic, swift, and unkind the way those things tend to be. People asked me afterward how I was holding up, and I always said, fine, because what else do you say? The truth is harder to put into words. It wasn't grief exactly, or at least not the loud kind people expect. It was more like walking into a room where the overhead light has burned out. Everything is still there. You can still see. But the quality of the seeing is different, and you notice it every time. I kept the chair. These days the chair belongs to Noah. He's my grandson, 10 years old, Richard's boy. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he walks the 6 blocks from school to the shop, drops his backpack next to the chair with a thud that rattles the back case slightly, and spends the next 2 hours doing homework with the focused intensity of someone who takes math very personally. He doesn't talk much while he works, neither do I. We've developed an arrangement over the past year that suits us both. He does his work, I do mine, and somewhere in the middle of it, Earl brings us each a small glass of apple juice without being asked. Noah has Margaret's eyes. I've never told him that. Some things you keep for yourself. I was thinking about this about Noah and the chair and the particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon in early June when the bell above the door rang and Richard walked in. My son is 42 years old. He has my height and his mother's coloring, and he works in commercial real estate on the east side of the river, which means he spends his days convincing people that spaces are worth more than they appear to be. He's good at it. He's always been good at making things seem like something other than what they are. He came in around 4:30 while Noah was still bent over a worksheet and Earl was polishing the front case with the slow, practiced movements of a man who has polished the same case 10,000 times. Richard said hello to Earl, ruffled Noah's hair in the distracted way people do when they're already thinking about something else, and then drifted toward the display cases. I watched him from the doorway of the back room. There's a look I've learned to recognize over 50 years in this business. Customers who love jewelry look at the pieces. They lean in, they slow down. Their eyes settle on individual stones the way you settle into a good chair. But some people who come through that door aren't looking at the jewelry at all. They're running numbers. You can see it in the way their gaze moves, not piece to piece, but case to case, shelf to shelf. A kind of inventory. Richard moved through the cases with that look. The same look I'd seen on buyers at estate sales when they weren't really there for the art. He said something about just being in the neighborhood. Said he hadn't seen the place in a while and wanted to check in. He asked how business was going, whether I had thought any more about the retirement conversation we'd had back in March, whether Earl was still full-time. Normal questions said in a normal voice with a smile that sat a half second too long on his face before fading. I answered the way I always answer, calmly, vaguely, without giving anything specific, a skill I also learned in this business. People show you their hand faster if they think you're not watching. After about 15 minutes, he said he had to get back across the bridge. He kissed the top of Noah's head this time, with more attention, shook Earl's hand, and walked out the door. The bell rang again. A delivery truck rumbled past on the street outside. Noah went back to his worksheet without looking up. I walked back to my workbench, sat down and opened the small notebook I've kept in the top left drawer since the autumn of 2022, the one I started the week after Margaret's memorial, when I found I needed somewhere to put the things I couldn't say out loud. Over the years, it had become something else, a record, dates, observations. The small things that don't mean anything on their own, but start to form a shape when you write them down and look at them over time. I wrote the date, June 3rd, 2025. Then I wrote R came in, looked at the cases the wrong way, asked about retirement again. I closed the notebook and looked out the window. Portland was doing what Portland does in early June, delivering a gray drizzle that couldn't quite decide if it was rain or fog, coating the street in a flat silver light. A woman walked past with a terrier on a leash. A cyclist cut around a double-parked delivery van. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Nothing that would tell you anything was wrong. 50 years of learning to see what others couldn't. I just never thought I'd have to use that skill on my own son. It started small, the way most things that matter always do. A cup of tea I didn't ask for handed to me, with a smile I didn't quite trust. Sandra had never been a particularly attentive daughter-in-law. Not cold exactly, just the kind of person who keeps a careful distance, who remembers birthdays with a card and nothing more, who asks how you're doing, without pausing long enough to hear the answer. For 17 years, we had maintained a perfectly cordial relationship, built almost entirely on avoidance. She stayed in her lane. I stayed in mine. It worked the way a lot of arrangements in family life work, not because they're good, but because nobody wants to be the one to disrupt them. Which is why when she started showing up at the shop in early July, I noticed, the first time she had what seemed like a reasonable excuse. She was nearby, she said. She'd been at a boutique 2 blocks up and thought she'd stop in to say hello. She brought tea in a paper cup from the place on the corner, chamomile, she said, knowing I didn't drink coffee. She set it on the edge of my workbench with a smile that was warm in the way stage lighting is warm, technically correct, but you're aware of the source. I thanked her. I wrapped my hands around the cup. I did not drink. We talked for about 20 minutes. She asked about Noah, how he was doing in school, whether he was still coming to the shop after class. She asked about Earl, whether his knee had gotten any better. All the right questions asked in the right order, with the right amount of concern. I answered each one. I watched her the way I watch a stone I'm not yet sure about, not staring, just attending. She left without buying anything, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she came back 4 days later, this time loose-leaf tea in a proper thermos, poured carefully into the ceramic mug she'd apparently noticed sitting on my shelf, the one Margaret had brought back from a trip to Vermont in 2014 that I'd never had the heart to put away. The attention to detail was deliberate. I recognized the gesture for what it was. Research. Sandra had been paying attention filing things away, and now she was using what she'd learned. The tea was good, I'll give her that. But it had a note at the back of the taste that I couldn't quite account for. Not unpleasant, just present in a way that chamomile alone didn't explain. Slightly bitter the way certain minerals are bitter, or the way some herbal supplements leave a trace on the back of your tongue. I took 2 sips, set the mug down, and moved it to the far corner of the bench without making a point of it. That afternoon, she asked me about the shop's bank accounts. She framed it carefully. She always framed things carefully, I was learning. It came wrapped in a story about a friend of hers whose elderly father had run into trouble accessing funds when he was hospitalized unexpectedly. "It's just something to think about," she said, "having someone listed who can manage things if anything ever came up." She said it the way you say things you've rehearsed too smooth, no hesitation, no searching for words. People who speak from genuine concern trip over themselves a little. They second-guess their phrasing. Sandra didn't trip over anything. I told her it was a good point and that I'd look into it. I said it in the voice I use when I mean neither of those things. Richard's change came around the same time, though it moved differently. He didn't come to the shop as often, instead he called. 3 times in the first 2 weeks of July, which was 3 more times than he'd called in all of June. The conversations followed a pattern. He had asked about my health first, then about the business, and then about 2/3 of the way through, he'd introduced the real topic, retirement, specifically whether I'd given any more thought to simplifying things, whether I'd spoken to a financial advisor recently, whether I'd considered bringing in someone to help manage the administrative side now that I wasn't getting any younger. Now that I'm not getting any younger. He said it every time in the same casual tone, like it was an observation and not a pressure point. I've dealt with enough negotiators in 45 years of buying and selling to know when someone is testing a soft spot. You say the thing enough times in a neutral voice, and eventually it stops sounding like a threat. Eventually, it just sounds like common sense. I let him say it. I agreed it was worth thinking about. I changed the subject to Noah's upcoming school year, which Richard was always willing to talk about, because it made him feel like a good father, and then I ended the call when it felt right. Way afterward, I sat at my workbench and thought about something a man once told me when I was 23 years old, and still learning the difference between a stone with real depth and one that only looked good under favorable light. The most dangerous thing in this business, he told me, isn't the buyer who insults you, it's the one who compliments you. I thought about that for a long time. Then I picked up my pen. I don't record every conversation in the notebook, just the ones that sit wrong afterward, the ones that leave a residue. I wrote down what Sandra had said about the bank accounts, the exact phrasing she had used. I wrote down Richard's retirement comments and the dates of the calls. I wrote down the thing about the tea not as an accusation, just as a detail. A stone you're not sure about yet, set aside for closer examination. By the 3rd week of July, Sandra had visited the shop 5 times. Each visit came with something tea, a small pastry from the French place 2 streets over. Once a copy of a magazine she thought I might enjoy. Each visit also came with a question, not always about money or property. Sometimes it was softer than that. Whether I'd thought about what would happen to the shop eventually, whether I had a plan for the inventory, whether I'd updated any of my important documents recently. At 74, I've had enough time to learn one thing that schools don't teach and families rarely discuss. The people who want something from you almost never ask for it directly. They get close first. They make themselves useful. They establish a presence, a habit, a sense of being owed a kind of trust. And then once the foundation is in place, they start to build. I knew what was being built. I just didn't know yet how high they planned to take it. On the last Friday of July, Sandra brought tea again. Same thermos, same mug, same smile. She poured it herself, set it in front of me, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing that mattered. When she left, I sat alone in the back room and picked up the mug. The bitterness was there again, faint but consistent. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, or if you trusted the person who handed it to you. I set the mug down, looked at the thin layer of residue that had settled at the bottom, a darker ring against the ceramic, barely visible in the afternoon light coming through the back window. For the first time in a long time, I felt cold. I found it on a Thursday. Not by accident I'd been looking, though I hadn't admitted that to myself, until the moment my hand touched the bottle. Sandra had left her coat. She'd come in that morning, stayed about 30 minutes, brought soup this time, instead of tea, asked me 3 carefully worded questions about whether I had recently spoken to an estate attorney, and then left in a hurry something about a meeting across town. Her coat stayed behind on the stool near the work table. I looked at it for the better part of an hour before I did anything about it. I went back to my work, finished setting a stone in a repair piece, wrote up 2 estimates, talked to Earl about a late delivery. Normal afternoon, except that every 20 minutes or so, my eyes returned to that coat hanging on the stool, like a question I hadn't decided to answer yet. At 4:15, Earl said goodnight, straightened his bow tie burgundy today, and headed out. I locked the front door, flipped the sign, and stood in the particular quiet that follows the end of a working day. Then I walked over and checked the pockets. The left side held a folded receipt and a half-empty pack of peppermint gum. The right side held a phone charger, a chapstick, and a small glass bottle roughly 2 inches tall, black cap, no commercial label. Just a strip of white medical tape around the middle, with something written in handwriting that was either very small or very hurried. The ink had smudged as if the cap had been replaced before the writing could dry. I stood with that bottle in my palm and didn't move for a long time. People expect anger in a moment like that. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was something cleaner, a cold, precise clarity, the same sensation that comes when you find the inclusion you've been half expecting in a stone you wanted to believe was flawless. You don't rage at a flaw, you simply see it. You accept that it's there, and then you decide what to do next. The tea sample was still in the back room. I had saved it the previous Friday, poured what remained into a small sealed jar, and tucked it behind a box of lens cloths, where no one would think to look. I set the jar next to the bottle on the workbench. 2 small objects in the late afternoon light, sitting side by side, like the beginning of a sentence I hadn't finished reading yet. I thought about calling the police. Then I thought better of it. Going to them now with 2 containers and a suspicion would accomplish one thing: it would tell Richard and Sandra that I knew. Whatever they were planning, I still didn't understand the full scope of it. How many people were involved, how long they'd been at it, how far they intended to take things. Moving too early would hand them the advantage of knowing I was aware. I needed more before I handed anything to anyone. The yellow pages were in the bottom drawer of the office desk, the physical directory, not a website. I wasn't going to search for an independent testing laboratory on any screen connected to my name. I found what I needed on the 3rd page under Laboratories Analytical and Testing, a small independent operation on Southeast Morrison that accepted private submissions with confidential results. No personal identification required. I wrote the address and number on a loose piece of paper, not in the notebook, a separate sheet I folded and carried in my shirt pocket and nowhere else. I called from the shop's landline at 4:53. The man who answered was brief and professional. Organic compound analysis, 8 to 10, business days $140, cash at drop-off, intake number. Only no name attached to the sample. I made an appointment for the following morning, confirmed the address, and said thank you. After I hung up, I wrapped both containers carefully in a cloth and placed them in my jacket's inside breast pocket, locked the front door, locked the office, drove home without the radio on. Not to the kitchen, not to the living room chair where I usually spent the first hour after work. I went upstairs to the small room at the end of the hall. Margaret's study, the one I had barely touched since the spring of 2022, her reading chair still angled toward the window, her lamp still on the side table beside it, her photograph on the shelf, the one from the Oregon coast in 2018, the last trip we took before everything changed. I sat in the wooden chair from the hallway. Not her chair, never her chair, and I talked to her. Quietly at first, then in a voice just low enough that it wouldn't have carried past the doorway. I told her what I'd found. I told her what I believed it meant. I told her I wasn't going to move until I understood the complete picture, because a wrong step now would be worse than no step at all. Margaret had little patience for hesitation dressed up as caution, but she understood the difference between the two better than anyone I've ever known. Real caution has a plan behind it. Hesitation is just fear with better posture. I wasn't afraid. I didn't yet know how far the plan extended or what ultimately they intended to take from me. But I knew what I had to do next, the same way I've always known what a stone requires before it can become what it was always meant to be. You find the line, you prepare, and when the moment is right, you commit completely. From this night forward, I could not afford to be anything less than that. The results came back on a Tuesday. I read them twice, folded the paper once along the center crease, and placed it in the false bottom of my workbench drawer, the same compartment where I had kept Margaret's engagement ring for 3 weeks, before I finally got up the nerve to propose. Some things you hide not because they're shameful, but because they're too important for open air. The report was 4 pages written in the dry, precise language of people who deal in facts and want no part of whatever you do with them. The summary was on page 1. The compound identified in both samples belonged to a class of substances with well-documented effects on the central nervous system, specifically on the kind of short-term memory processing that, in older adults, tends to look indistinguishable from the early stages of cognitive decline. Used consistently over several months, the effects would be gradual enough to seem natural. Documented carefully by, say, a physician who had been told what to look for, they would be sufficient to build a clinical record that could support a legal argument about a man's capacity to manage his own affairs. I sat with that for a long time. Then I got up, went to the sink in the back room, washed my hands with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who has just finished a job, and went back to work. That afternoon, I started practicing. It began with small things, picking up the wrong tool from the bench, and then looking at it with a moment's confusion before setting it down. Asking Earl what day it was, even though I knew perfectly well what day it was. Pausing mid-sentence as if the next word had slipped out of reach. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would read as performance if you were watching for it. Just the texture of a mind that was slowly losing its grip on the edges of things. I'd spent 50 years training my eyes to detect the nearly undetectable. It turned out the same precision worked in reverse. I practiced at home in the evenings in front of the bathroom mirror. I want to be matter-of-fact about this because that's how I approached it as a technical problem, not a personal indignity. I needed to learn to do something convincingly that I had never done before. That required practice the same way setting an unusual cut requires practice the same way any skill worth having requires repetition before it becomes reliable. What I hadn't anticipated was the cost. Richard came in on a Thursday in the second week of August. He was in good spirits, lighter than he'd been in months actually, which told me something about what he thought was happening. We talked for a while about Noah's upcoming school year, about a repair job I was finishing up, about nothing in particular. At one point, naturally, the conversation drifted to Margaret. I pretended not to remember the name of the restaurant where we'd celebrated her last birthday. It was a place on Northwest 21st that she'd loved for years, the kind of detail that lives in your body, not just your mind the way certain things do when you've carried them long enough. I let my eyes go slightly unfocused. I said something like, "The Italian place, you know, the one on the west side, she always ordered the same thing," and then trailed off with a small, effortful frown. Richard said the name of the restaurant. I said, right, of course. And I nodded, like a man receiving information rather than a man who already knew. He moved on quickly. People always do when they get the confirmation they're looking for. What I had not expected was the thing that happened in my chest during those 4 seconds. Not grief exactly. I'd made a kind of peace with grief over the past 3 years. Something else. Something that felt like a small, precise betrayal of a private agreement I hadn't known I was keeping. Margaret's name in my mouth being used as a prop, in a performance she would never have asked me to give. I stood at the workbench after Richard left and held very still for a moment. Then I picked up my tools and finished the repair piece I'd been working on. That was how I handled it every time. The feeling would come sharp and quick, and I would let it pass through without slowing down. You don't stop in the middle of cutting a stone, because the work is harder than you expected. You adjust your grip and continue. Sandra's tea visits continued through August. Each time I went through the routine, accepting the mug, wrapping both hands around it, exchanging pleasantries. And then, when the conversation shifted, or Sandra looked away, tilting the mug toward the small potted plant that sat on the corner of the workbench. A jade plant I'd had for 11 years that had survived drought and neglect and 2 relocations without complaint. By the 3rd week of August, it was looking considerably less healthy. I didn't feel good about that. No one noticed something different about me. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon, dropped his bag in the usual way, and settled into the chair with his homework. About 40 minutes in, without looking up from his worksheet, he said, "Grandpa, what are you practicing?" I looked over at him. "What do you mean, you keep doing the thing?" he said. "Where you stop and look like you forgot something, but then you don't actually forget. You go right back to what you were doing." 10 years old. Margaret's eyes, and it turned out something of her radar as well. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "I'm practicing remembering." He looked at me with the particular expression children get when they suspect an adult is telling the truth in a way they're not entirely meant to understand. Then he went back to his worksheet, practicing remembering. It was the most honest thing I'd said to anyone in weeks. By the end of August, the performance had become something close to second nature. Richard and Sandra were seeing what they expected to see, a man whose edges were softening, whose grip on the details of his own life was quietly loosening. They were building their case on a foundation I was helping them construct, which meant I also knew every stone in it. Some evenings I sat at the workbench after closing and held my hands out in front of me, palms down. The way I'd done since my apprenticeship, a habit from the days when steadiness was a professional requirement, when a tremor in the wrong moment could ruin a week of work. My hands were steady, both of them, every time. That was enough. As long as that was true, I was still in control of the only thing that mattered. Someone would need to confirm the symptoms. A doctor. And knowing Richard, that part had already been arranged. September always reminds me of Henry Cross. I don't know why, exactly, maybe it's the light. Portland in September has a particular quality to its afternoons, a low amber slant that comes through the west-facing windows and makes everything look older than it is. The stones in the display cases catch it differently than they do in summer. Less brilliant, more considered, like they're being asked a different kind of question. Henry would have had something to say about that. He always did. I met him in the winter of 1974. I was 23 years old, recently arrived in Portland from a small town in eastern Oregon, where the most complex piece of jewelry anyone owned was a high school class ring. I had some aptitude and no training, and I had responded to a hand-lettered notice in the window of a shop on West Burnside that said, "Apprentice wanted. Patience required. Pay modest." The last part turned out to be an understatement. Henry Cross was 57 years old when I started working for him, which means he was exactly the age I am now, in the photographs I still have from those early years. It's a strange thing to look at a man you remember as old and realize he was younger than you are today. It rearranges something in the way you think about time. He was a compact man, unhurried in his movements, with the kind of hands that seemed to operate independently of the rest of his body, steady and precise while he talked, gestured, argued, did everything else simultaneously. He had opinions about everything and stated them without apology, and he had a particular gift for saying things you didn't understand until 3 years later. One afternoon in my first month, I was struggling with a setting, a simple prong job, that I kept getting wrong, and I asked him why it mattered so much to get it exactly right, when the customer probably wouldn't notice the difference. He put down what he was working on, looked at me for a moment, and said, "A real stone doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to be placed where the light can find it." I wrote that down when I got home. I've thought about it most days since. He taught me everything I know about this work. Not just the technical side, though. He was exacting about that, but the larger thing underneath it. The patience. The willingness to sit with something unfinished rather than rush it to completion before it was ready. The understanding that what a stone becomes is always more important than what it looked like when you found it. We worked together for 9 years. Then I opened my own shop, and the years did what years do. They move forward quickly, carrying everything with them. I kept in touch with Henry, the way you keep in touch with people you intend to see more often than you do. Cards at Christmas, the occasional phone call, a visit every year or two that was always too short. He had a son, a boy of about 8, when I left the shop, quiet and watchful, the kind of child who listens more than he speaks. I don't remember much else about him. I wasn't paying close enough attention. That's something I've had to sit with. Around 1998, Henry ran into serious financial difficulty. The details aren't mine to recount in full. It involved a partner who turned out to be less trustworthy than he appeared, and a series of decisions made in good faith that unraveled badly. He called me twice that year. I remember both calls clearly, which is its own kind of indictment. I was in the middle of expanding the shop, taking on debt of my own, managing a staff for the first time. I listened. I said the things you say. I didn't do the thing that actually would have helped, which was to show up. Henry's shop closed in 2000. He passed away in the spring of 2002. I found out through a mutual acquaintance 2 weeks after the fact. I sent flowers to an address I wasn't certain was still current. I told myself I'd been out of touch, that it had been years, that there was nothing I could have done differently. I've never fully believed that. There is a box on the shelf in my back workroom, behind a row of reference books and a small lamp I keep meaning to replace. Inside the box, wrapped in a square of dark velvet, is a rough diamond approximately the size of a large marble, irregular, cloudy the color of old ice. Henry gave it to me in the summer of 2001, a few months after his shop closed, and about a year before he was gone. He brought it in a small paper bag and set it on my workbench without ceremony. "I won't get to it," he said. "You will when you're ready." I asked him what it needed. He said, "You'll know when you look at it properly." I have looked at it properly many times. I've taken it out of the box, held it under magnification, made notes about the inclusions and the grain structure and the angles that would need to be worked. I know exactly what it needs and how I would approach it. I have never cut it. I'm not entirely sure I can explain why, except to say that some things accumulate a weight over time that has nothing to do with their physical mass. That stone represents something I haven't yet earned the right to finish, a conversation I owe Henry, that I've been postponing for 23 years, telling myself there was still time, that I'd get to it when I was ready. I spent most of September the way I spend most Septembers, working, watching, keeping the performance consistent. Richard called twice. I navigated both conversations without incident. Sandra came in 3 more times with her thermos. I navigated those 2 one sip, and then the jade plant, which was now looking genuinely unwell. Late in the month, a Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray, damp day that Portland produces in quantity once summer releases its brief hold, Sandra came in to drop off what she said was a recipe she had written down for me from a soup I had mentioned liking. She stayed 20 minutes and spent most of them on her phone, partly turned away from me, near the front of the store. I was in the back close enough to hear far enough that she'd apparently forgotten I was there. She was talking to someone in a low voice, the kind people use when they want to sound normal and aren't quite managing it. Most of it was unremarkable. But toward the end, before she wrapped up the call, she mentioned a name, Mitchell. Just the name, no context, no explanation. Followed by something about next week, and then a sentence I didn't catch clearly. She lowered her voice for that last part, whether deliberately or by instinct, I couldn't say. She came to the back a minute later, cheerful, handed me the recipe card, stayed another 5 minutes, and left. After she was gone, I stood at the workbench and looked at the shelf where Henry's stone sat in its box behind the row of books. 23 years. I hadn't touched it once. I opened the notebook and wrote down the name, Mitchell. Just that, and the date, and the fact that she hadn't known I was listening. Then I closed the notebook and looked at the box for a long time. I wasn't sure what I was still waiting for. October came in, and the pressure changed the way pressure always does when something is getting ready to give. Richard's visits to the shop became regular in a way they had never been before. Not dropping by, arriving with a purpose he took less trouble to conceal than he had in the summer. He started asking about valuation. Not directly, Richard was never direct. He approached the subject, The way you approach a dog you're not sure about from the side, slowly without making eye contact. He would mention that a property down the street had recently sold, and wasn't it interesting what prices were doing in the Pearl District these days? He would note that a friend of his had recently had his estate documents professionally reviewed and found several things that needed updating. He would suggest in the mildest possible terms that it might be worth having someone come in and take stock just to simplify the paperwork, Dad, just to reduce the administrative burden while you focus on the work you love. The phrasing shifted slightly each time, but the destination was always the same. He was testing the approach that got the least resistance, the way a locksmith works through a combination. He doesn't yet know one number at a time, listening for the click. Each conversation ended the same way, with me agreeing it was worth thinking about, and Richard leaving, looking faintly satisfied. And me standing at my workbench afterward, writing down exactly what he'd said and when. The call came on a Wednesday in the second week of October. A woman named Patrice. She'd worked as a clerk at the Multnomah County Courthouse for nearly 30 years. And she and Margaret had served together on their church's fundraiser committee for most of a decade. She called the shop's landline at 2:30 and asked if I had a few minutes. She told me carefully, in the way of someone doing a favor they couldn't officially be doing, that a petition had been filed. A conservatorship petition, the kind that asks a court to appoint someone to manage the financial and personal affairs of an individual who may no longer be capable of managing them independently. She said she couldn't tell me more than that. She thought I should know. I thanked her. I told her Margaret always said she was one of the good ones. She said she was sorry and she meant it, and we said goodbye. I held the receiver for a moment after the line went quiet. Not from shock, I had been building toward this understanding for months. More from the particular weight that comes when something you suspected becomes something you know. Suspicion leaves room for doubt. Knowledge doesn't. So, that was the full architecture of it. Not just a conversation or a signature at a kitchen table, a court filing, official, documented. The kind of thing that, if it proceeded unchallenged, would hand legal authority over my finances, my property, my ability to make decisions about my own life, to Richard. With Mitchell Hale providing the legal scaffolding, the substance in Sandra's thermos wasn't incidental. It was the foundation for a physician's report that would say exactly what they needed it to say. I had been prepared for something. I had not been fully prepared for how thoroughly they had prepared. I added the call to the notebook. Then I went back to work. Mitchell Hale arrived on an evening in the third week of November. Richard brought him to the house, not the shop. Coming to the house was a statement. He was 44 medium height, wearing a charcoal suit that fit too well to be off the rack. Richard introduced him as a family advisor, not a lawyer, which he was, but a family advisor, which told me immediately how they intended to frame everything that followed. He shook my hand with both of his right hand gripping left hand, covering the kind of handshake that lasts 2 seconds longer than it needs to. He said it was a pleasure to finally meet me. That word finally meant Richard had been talking about me for some time. I filed that away without comment. His voice was the most unsettling thing about him. Genuinely pleasant, warm, unhurried, with the kind of measured cadence you develop after years of talking people into things they hadn't planned on agreeing to. He said nothing objectionable that evening. He complimented the house, asked thoughtful questions about the shop's history, expressed what appeared to be genuine interest in the craft of jewelry making, and mentioned that his grandmother had owned a piece she'd always called the finest thing she possessed. I watched him the way I watch everything quietly, without appearing to. Noah was there that evening, a Tuesday, his usual night for dinner. He sat at the far end of the table and ate with the particular quietness he had been carrying since September. He used to ask questions at dinner rapid fire and unself-conscious, the way children are when they feel completely at ease. That fall, the questions had stopped. He watched instead, the adults, the conversation, the small ways people positioned themselves and adjusted their voices depending on who was listening. At one point, Mitchell Hale directed a question at him about school. Noah answered in 2 sentences politely and returned his attention to his plate. When I glanced over a few minutes later, he was looking at Mitchell Hale with an expression I recognized from somewhere close. He was measuring. After they left, Noah helped me clear the table without being asked. We did the dishes in the easy silence we'd built over the past year. When I walked him out to Richard's car, he stopped on the front step and turned around. The porch light was behind me, and I couldn't read his face clearly, but I could see that he was working something out, some thought or question that hadn't yet found the right words. He stood there for 3 or 4 seconds. Then he pulled his jacket tighter and got in the car without saying it. Whatever it was, he'd decided to keep it. I watched the taillights until they turned the corner, and the street was quiet again. Inside, I sat in the armchair in the front room. Margaret's chair, the one she'd always claimed, was the most comfortable in the house. The one I'd spent 3 years avoiding without ever quite admitting why. I sat in it that night because I was tired of avoiding things. For the first time in longer than I could easily measure, I felt genuinely alone. Not the manageable solitude of the past 3 years. I had made a kind of arrangement with that. This was something raw. The particular loneliness of a man surrounded by people he cannot speak honestly to. Not one of them. Not even the boy who had his grandmother's eyes and was quietly learning to be afraid of something he couldn't yet name. I sat in that chair for a long time. By early December, everything was already in motion. The pieces had been set. Now they were just waiting for the right moment to close. Richard called it planning for the future. I called it watching someone measure the drapes before the funeral. December arrived the way it always does in Portland gray, and deliberate the rain shifting from the half-hearted drizzle of autumn to something with more conviction behind it. The city pulled inward. People walked faster. The shop windows along the street filled up with lights and arrangements that were meant to suggest warmth, and mostly succeeded. I had put a small wreath on the door of Whitfield Gems every December for 43 years, and I put one up again this year, because some things you keep doing, not out of sentiment, but out of the belief that normalcy maintained carefully enough, is its own form of armor. Richard called on the 3rd of December. He opened the way he always opened, asking about Noah, about Earl, about whether the holiday season was bringing in any interesting repair work. 5 minutes of preamble carefully calibrated to feel like conversation. Then he introduced the real subject he had been thinking he said about how much I was managing on my own these days. The shop, the house, the finances. It was a lot for anyone, he said, let alone someone at my stage of life. He wasn't suggesting anything dramatic, just a temporary arrangement, a limited power of attorney that would allow him to assist with certain administrative matters during the holiday period, when things could get complicated and stressful, and I deserved to be able to enjoy the season without worrying about paperwork. He said the word temporary 4 times in that conversation. I counted. I told him it was a thoughtful idea and that I would give it serious consideration. I used the word serious deliberately because it made people feel heard without committing to anything. Richard said he was glad and that Mitchell had actually drafted something straightforward that we could go over together and that there was no rush. But if I wanted to have everything in order before Christmas, it might be worth sitting down sometime in the next week or two. No rush before Christmas. I wrote down both phrases after we hung up. Mitchell Hale called twice in the first week of December. The first call came on a Tuesday morning. He said he was just following up on the conversation Richard and I had had, and wanted to make sure I hadn't had any questions about the document he'd prepared. His voice had the same quality it had in person, smooth and unhurried, like water finding the path of least resistance. He mentioned that the document was really quite simple, that he had drafted similar arrangements for many families in my situation, that it was genuinely the kind of thing that gave people peace of mind. I told him I appreciated the call and that I was still reviewing my options. The second call came Friday afternoon, shorter this time, just checking in. He said, making sure I had everything I needed, reminding me that his schedule through the holidays was fairly open if I wanted to meet. He said he hoped I was well and that he was looking forward to seeing me over the holiday. I hadn't invited him to anything over the holiday. I sat with that detail for a while after the call ended. By the second week of December, the shape of their timeline had become clear to me. The conservatorship petition that Patrice had told me about was still pending, sitting in the court system, waiting for a hearing date. But if I signed a voluntary power of attorney before that hearing occurred, Richard wouldn't need the court's decision. A voluntary document signed by a man who appeared to be of sound mind and free will would give him substantially the same authority, faster, cleaner, without the scrutiny that a contested court proceeding would invite. Christmas Eve was the target. The family together, the atmosphere softened by the season, Mitchell Hale present with his pleasant voice and his well-fitted suit, and his document that was really quite simple. I had been in this business long enough to recognize a closing strategy when I saw one. Noah came to the shop on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of the month. He came in the usual way, bag dropped, chair claimed homework, produced, but something was different about his energy that day. He worked for about 20 minutes and then stopped, which he almost never did. He sat looking at his worksheet for a moment, then set his pencil down and turned to face me. "Grandpa," he said, "are you okay?" Not the careful measuring look from last month. A direct question asked with the particular seriousness of a child who has decided that the adults around him are not going to raise the subject on their own. I looked at him across the workbench. 10 years old, sitting in the chair that had been his grandmother's, asking me the question that no one else in my life had thought to ask plainly. I said I was fine. He held my gaze for a moment in the way that children do, when they are deciding whether to accept an answer or push further. Then he said, "Okay," and picked up his pencil and went back to the worksheet. He didn't believe me. I could see that clearly. And the thing I couldn't tell him, the thing I had to sit with quietly while he worked through his math problems 3 feet away, was that I wasn't entirely sure I believed myself. Not about being fine, about being ready. Those were two different things, and I had been confusing them more often than I wanted to admit. That evening after Noah had gone and Earl had locked up and the shop was quiet, I sat at the workbench with the notebook open in front of me. I wrote down Mitchell Hale's name and the dates of both calls and the exact phrasing he had used each time. I wrote down Richard's language from the third temporary administrative peace of mind, and the fact that he'd already told Mitchell Hale I would likely be sitting down with him soon, before I'd agreed to any such thing. I wrote down the phrase Mitchell Hale had used about the holiday, the one about looking forward to seeing me unsolicited. Then I closed the notebook and set my pen down. They thought I was waiting holding still out of confusion or inertia, or the slow erosion that they had been carefully engineering since July. They thought the man sitting behind that workbench was exactly what they had been building him to appear to be. They were wrong about that. They had been wrong about it from the beginning. I wasn't waiting. I was preparing. And there is a difference between those two things that I would in time be very glad they never understood. December 24th, 2025. I woke up that morning knowing something was going to happen. I just didn't know it would come from a direction I never could have anticipated. The house smelled like coffee and pine. I'd put the tree up the weekend before a real 1.7 feet Douglas fir from the lot on Northwest Thurman, where I'd been buying trees since 1987. Margaret had insisted on real trees every year, without exception, on the grounds that a house that smelled like Christmas actually was Christmas, and everything else was just decoration. I had kept the tradition without her, in the same way I kept most of our traditions not out of sentimentality exactly, but because some habits have roots deep enough that removing them would take more than you're willing to disturb. Noah arrived at 9. Richard had dropped him off on the way to some errand, which was fine by me. It meant I had Noah to myself for the better part of the morning, which turned out to be the best part of the day. He came through the door with his coat still half on and immediately began a critical assessment of the tree's ornament distribution, which he found lacking on the lower left quadrant. I gave him the box of ornaments and stayed out of his way. We worked through the morning together, the two of us Noah, reorganizing the tree with the focused energy of someone who has clear aesthetic opinions and no patience for symmetry that isn't quite right, and me in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the counter with the unhurried rhythm of a man who has been cooking Christmas dinner for 50 years and stopped consulting recipes sometime in the early 90s. The turkey had gone in at 7. The potatoes were waiting. The pie, Margaret's recipe, the one I made from memory, now was cooling on the rack by the window. Noah had found a playlist on his phone, one of those stations that plays nothing but old Christmas standards, and he'd set it on the counter where it filled the kitchen with a sound that was somehow both familiar and distant. The way certain songs are when you've heard them so many times They've become less about music and more about the years they've collected. Bing Crosby, Nat King Cole, the occasional Sinatra. Grandpa, Noah said at one point from somewhere deep inside the lower branches, "Did you know that the song White Christmas was actually written by a Jewish man who missed the Christmases of his childhood?" I told him I did know that. "I think that's kind of the whole point of it," he said. "It's not really about snow. It's about missing something." He was 10 years old. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I told him that was probably the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about that song. He came out from the branches looking pleased with a strand of tinsel in his hair that he didn't notice until Earl, who had stopped by briefly to drop off a card, pointed it out an hour later. The morning was good. I want to be clear about that. Whatever came after the morning was genuinely good. The kind of ordinary, unremarkable goodness that you don't fully recognize while it's happening, that only becomes visible in contrast later. Richard and Sandra arrived at 5 o'clock. Richard was in good spirits, the particular brightness of a man who believes the day is going according to plan. He brought wine, helped himself to the kitchen without being asked, and moved through the house with the ease of someone who had already begun in some interior way to think of it as his. Sandra was quieter than usual. She hugged me when she came in, which she didn't always do, and her eyes went briefly around the room in a way that wasn't exactly casual. Noah retreated to the corner of the living room with a book which was a new development. He used to stay close to the adults at family gatherings. This year, he had apparently decided that a certain amount of distance was a reasonable response to something he couldn't yet articulate. Mitchell Hale arrived at 6:17. Richard introduced him again as a family advisor, the same framing as November, delivered with the same practiced ease. Mitchell Hale shook my hand in the same way he always did 2 seconds too long, and said something warm about how kind it was to be included in such a lovely evening. He had brought a bottle of wine, more expensive than the one Richard had brought, which I noted and said nothing about. The four of us moved through the pre-dinner hour with the careful politeness of people who are each waiting for something without wanting to appear to be waiting. Richard asked about the shop. Mitchell Hale asked thoughtful questions about the neighborhood, the history of the house. Sandra set the table moving between kitchen and dining room, with a quiet efficiency that would have seemed helpful if I hadn't been paying attention to what she was doing with her eyes. I was paying attention. It was during one of Sandra's passes through the kitchen. She was getting the serving dishes from the cabinet above the refrigerator that I walked to the counter to check on something at the stove and past the kitchen table. The folder was sitting on the far end, half covered by Richard's coat. He had set the coat there when he arrived, draped it over the back of the chair, and the folder had been underneath it or inside it and had worked its way partially into view sometime in the past hour. A plain manila folder, the kind you can buy at any office supply store, with a white label on the tab. Whitfield Estate Transfer of Assets, December 24th. I read it in the time it takes to take a step. I did not stop walking. I did not change my expression or my pace. I checked the burner I had come to check, adjusted it slightly, and went back to the living room. I had been performing small, unremarkable behaviors for 5 months. This was the most important one. By 7:30, everything was on the table. The turkey, the potatoes, the green beans, with the almonds the way Margaret had always made them. The wine was poured. The candles were lit. Noah had insisted on candles, had found the old brass holders in the sideboard drawer, and polished them himself that afternoon, without being asked. Richard sat at one end of the table. Mitchell Hale sat to his left, Sandra across from him. Noah next to me, close enough that his arm was almost touching mine. The clock on the wall read 7:42 p.m. I looked around the table, everything in its place, everyone where they had arranged to be. The room warm, the candles, steady, the food going cold, in the way food does when people are waiting for something before they begin. I picked up my fork and knife. The doorbell rang. Nobody moved for a half second. Then I set down my fork, pushed back my chair, and went to answer it. I don't know what I expected to see when I opened the door. But it wasn't him. The cold came in first, a wall of it, the sharp, wet cold of a Portland December that had turned serious sometime in the past hour. Beyond the porch light's reach, the street was dark and moving, the kind of heavy rainfall that looks almost like snow when it catches the light at a certain angle. And standing on the front step just inside the edge of the porch overhang was a man. He was around 45. It was hard to be more precise than that. Cold and exhaustion do their own kind of work on a face, and his had clearly seen both recently and at length. His coat was a dark canvas field jacket, the kind that had been adequate for the weather it was designed for, but was not adequate for tonight. It was soaked through at the shoulders and cuffs. His hair was going gray at the temples, cut short in a way that had grown out past its intention. He hadn't shaved in several days. But his eyes. That was the thing I noticed first, before the coat, before the hair, before any of the rest of it. His eyes were tired, genuinely tired, the tiredness of someone who has not slept properly in longer than one night. But they were also completely unsettlingly alert. There was nothing unfocused about them. They took me in with a kind of quiet precision that I recognized, though I couldn't immediately have said from where. He said he was sorry to disturb me. He said he'd been walking for a while, and the storm had gotten worse faster than he'd expected, and he wondered if he might wait somewhere dry until it eased up, and if there was any chance of something to eat. He said it simply, without performance, without the particular cadence of practiced asking. He was stating facts and making a request, and he was prepared to accept whatever the answer was. I looked at him for a moment. Then I opened the door wider and told him to come in. Richard was on his feet before I had turned back to the table. He said my name in the tone people use when they want to stop something, without saying what the thing is. I told him to sit down and get an extra chair from the hallway closet. He said quietly, the way he said things he meant seriously, that we didn't know this person, and that it might not be the best idea. I said I was aware we didn't know him. That was generally true of strangers. I went to the kitchen to get another plate. Sandra said something about safety, about not knowing who was out there on a night like this. Her voice reasonable and concerned in a way that would have seemed genuine if I hadn't spent the past 6 months cataloging the things that seemed genuine about Sandra and weren't. I didn't respond to that either. Mitchell Hale said nothing. He had turned in his chair to watch the man come in from the cold, and he stayed turned, watching with an expression that was careful in a way his expressions hadn't been before. He was evaluating something. I wasn't sure yet what. Earl had once told me years ago that you learn more about a person in the first 30 seconds after something unexpected happens than you do in a year of normal conversation. What I learned in those 30 seconds was Richard's first instinct was control. Sandra's was anxiety, genuine or performed. Mitchell Hale's was assessment. The man sat in the chair Richard had, with visible reluctance retrieved from the hallway. He took his coat off at my suggestion and hung it on the back. It was wet enough that it left a small, dark mark on the wood, and he sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the table with the particular self-containment of a person who has learned not to take up more space than they have been given. I served him from the dishes that were still out: turkey, potatoes, green beans. He thanked me in a voice that was quiet and even, and he began to eat. He ate slowly, not self-consciously, not performing gratitude, just slowly, in the way of someone for whom the pace of eating had long since ceased to be a social matter. He ate the way people eat when they are genuinely hungry, but have learned to govern that hunger so it doesn't govern them. I had seen that quality before in people who'd spent time in circumstances where control over small things was the only control available. Noah was watching him from across the table with the open attention that children deploy before they learn it's considered impolite. The rest of the table had rearranged itself into a careful simulation of a normal dinner. Richard asking Mitchell Hale something about a development project, Sandra refilling her wine glass. The conversation continuing over and around the stranger at the end of the table, the way water moves around an obstacle. I watched the man instead. Halfway through his plate, without shifting his attention from his food, he reached into the inside pocket of his damp coat hanging on the chair behind him and set something on the corner of the table beside his plate. A phone. Old model, the screen, worn at the edges from use. The case was an incongruous shade of pale pink, the kind of case that comes on a phone bought second-hand or passed along from someone else. He had wrapped it in a single layer of thin plastic, the kind from a produce bag sealed at the top with a rubber band. The plastic had fogged slightly from the warmth of the room. He set it down the way you set down something you want to keep track of. Not prominently, just within reach. Noah looked at the phone, Then he looked at the man. Then, with the directness that I had come to regard as one of his most reliable qualities, he said, "Are you a police officer?" The man looked up from his plate. He looked at Noah for a moment, not the brief, dismissive look adults give children when they're answering a question they don't take seriously, but an actual pause, as if the question deserved consideration. Then he said, "I used to do something like that." Noah nodded, apparently satisfied. He picked up his fork. I noted the answer. I noted the phone. I noted the way the man had looked at Noah with attention, with something that might have been recognition of a quality he respected. I filed all of it away without comment because that was what this particular moment required. And then I became aware in the peripheral way you become aware of things you've trained yourself to watch, that Mitchell Hale had gone very still. He was looking at the phone on the corner of the table. Then his gaze moved to the man sitting beside it. It was a careful look, controlled nothing that would read as alarm to anyone watching casually. But I had been watching Mitchell Hale for 2 months, and I knew what his comfortable expression looked like. This was not it. Recognition flickered subtle but unmistakable. Like he had seen that face before somewhere, he hadn't expected to see it again. For the first time all evening, Mitchell Hale did not look comfortable at all. Mitchell Hale made his first mistake exactly 11 minutes after the stranger sat down. I know it was 11 minutes because I was watching the clock on the wall above the sideboard, not conspicuously the way you watch something. You want people to know you're watching, but in the peripheral, habitual way of a man who has spent 50 years doing precise work in measured time. The dinner had resumed after a fashion. Plates were passed, wine was poured. Richard had steered the conversation back to something about property values in the West Hills, and Mitchell Hale had followed along with the attentive pleasantness that was apparently his default setting in all situations. The stranger ate quietly and said nothing. 11 minutes in, Mitchell Hale set his fork down, reached into the leather portfolio he'd placed against the leg of his chair when he arrived, and produced a folder. Not the manila folder I'd seen on the kitchen table. This one was newer, the kind of presentation folder you buy when you want something to look considered rather than casual. He set it on the table beside his plate and looked at me with the expression he'd been calibrating all evening. He said he hoped I didn't mind. He knew the timing wasn't ideal, but since we were all here together, it might be a natural moment to take a few minutes and look over something he and Richard had been putting together. Just a simple document, he said. A temporary arrangement that would allow Richard to assist with certain administrative matters over the coming months. Nothing that couldn't be revisited. He slid the folder a few inches in my direction. The voice at the other end of the table said, very pleasantly, "What kind of attorney brings paperwork to Christmas dinner?" The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when something lands that everyone heard but no one was prepared for. Mitchell Hale looked at the stranger with an expression that was trying to remain hospitable and not quite managing it. He said something about the holidays being a natural time for family planning conversations. The stranger nodded slowly as if considering this. Then he said, "Is that a temporary power of attorney or something filed through the court?" Mitchell Hale's jaw moved before his answer did. "It's a straightforward private arrangement, because those are two different instruments," the stranger said, in the same unhurried tone he'd used to ask Noah to pass the salt 20 minutes earlier. A private POA requires the principal to have full legal capacity at the time of signing. A court-ordered conservatorship goes through a different process entirely. I'm just wondering which one this is, since the approach seems to involve elements of both. The room had stopped pretending to be a dinner. Richard said the man's name, not his name, since nobody at that table knew it yet, but, hey, the sharp warning version. The word reduced to a single syllable that was supposed to communicate that he had no standing here and should be aware of it. The stranger looked at Richard with an expression of mild, genuine interest, as if Richard had said something worth examining rather than something meant to silence him. Then he looked back at Mitchell Hale and said, "When was the conservatorship petition filed? Because if it's already in the system at Multnomah County, then having your client sign a private document tonight would be, I'm not a lawyer, but I believe the word is irregular." Mitchell Hale closed the folder. It was a small movement practiced and controlled, but it was the wrong movement. If the document had been what he claimed it was, simple, benign, something any reasonable family might put together for the holidays, the response to that question would have been explanation, if not retreat. The closing of the folder was an answer in itself, and everyone at the table understood it, even if only one of them understood why. I stood up. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't say, because it matters. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't reference the folder I'd seen on the kitchen table, or the conservatorship petition, or the months of careful observation I had conducted without anyone's knowledge. I simply stood up, which at my age and in my own house carries a weight that doesn't require explanation, and I said that I would not be signing anything tonight. Not the document in the folder, not any document. Not because I'd been persuaded otherwise by anyone at the table, but because it was my decision to make, and I had made it, and that was the end of the matter. Then I looked at Mitchell Hale and told him that I thought it was probably time for him to head home. He held my gaze for 3 seconds. I counted those too. Then he picked up his portfolio, excused himself with the kind of formal politeness that is indistinguishable from contempt if you know what you're looking at, and went to get his coat from the front closet. I heard the front door open and close. I did not go to see him out. I sat back down. Noah was looking at his plate with the careful neutrality of a child who has understood considerably more than the adults in the room intended him to understand, and has decided that the best available response is stillness. His fork was set at a precise angle across the rim of his plate, the posture of a person who has finished eating and has been sitting with that fact for a while. Richard's face had gone the particular color of a man whose contingency plans have just run out. He was sitting very straight the way people sit when they're trying to project control over a situation that has moved beyond their control and not quite succeeding. His wine glass was in front of him, but he hadn't touched it in some time. Sandra looked at Richard. Richard looked at the phone on the corner of the table, the pale pink case still wrapped in its plastic, sitting where the stranger had placed it an hour ago, and where it had remained, unremarked upon by its owner through an entire dinner and everything that had followed. Nobody said anything for a long time. The candles had burned down an inch since we'd sat down. The food on the table had gone from warm to cool in the patient, indifferent way that food does when the people around it have found other things to think about. Outside, the rain was still coming down against the windows, steady and unhurried, with nowhere it needed to be. After Richard and Sandra went upstairs, I asked the man if he wanted more tea. He said yes. I made 2 cups, the real kind, without anything extra in it. It was the first time in months I had made tea for someone in that kitchen, without thinking carefully about what I was putting in it. The difference was noticeable, even if only to me. We sat at the cleared kitchen table. The good dishes were stacked by the sink. Outside, the rain kept its steady conversation with the windows. The house was quiet in the particular way of people pretending to sleep, a different silence from actual sleep, closer to held breath. I'd lived here long enough to know the difference without having to think about it. I set his cup in front of him and sat down across the table. "Your name," I said, not a question, just the first thing. He wrapped both hands around the cup, the way people do when warmth is still something they have to remind themselves to accept. He looked at the cup for a moment, then at me. "Daniel Cross, 45 years old. Former Special Agent, FBI Financial Crimes Division, Portland Field Office. 11 years before I was terminated." He said the word without softening it, without the sideways phrasing people usually reach for. I appreciated that. I documented a pattern of misconduct inside our own office during a major case. I reported it through the proper internal channels. The channels determined that the most efficient resolution was to remove the person who had done the documenting. There was no bitterness in how he said it. I found that more convincing than if there had been. Bitterness performs itself for an audience. What he carried instead was the flat, settled weight of something examined from every angle and accepted for what it was. After that, I applied for a private investigator license through Oregon. Straightforward process if you have the background and a clean record outside the termination. I've been working independently for about 3 years now. "And Richard?" I said. He nodded. 18 months ago, a former colleague flagged unusual movement in a set of accounts tied to a property development company your son holds a partnership stake in. The pattern matched wire fraud funds being moved through a series of intermediary accounts to obscure both origin and destination. Each transaction small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic review, collectively over time significant. He placed the pink case phone on the table between us. Everything I've collected is backed up and encrypted separately. The phone is just the access point. I have 18 months of financial records, internal communications, and 3 recorded conversations made in locations where Oregon's single-party consent law applies. It's enough. You chose tonight specifically, I said. I'd been close enough to the situation long enough to know they had a hard deadline. If the document got signed tonight, the legal position shifts considerably harder to challenge, harder to reverse. He paused. I also needed to understand something before I knocked on that door, whether you didn't know what was happening to you, or whether you did. And now you know, I said. Now I know, he said. We sat quietly for a moment. The rain moved outside, a gust pressing against the glass, then releasing. From upstairs, nothing. I looked at the man across the table. Daniel Cross. I turned the name over the way you turn a stone before you decide what it is. Then I said, your father's name was Henry. The stillness that crossed his face was small but unmistakable. Not surprise, something older than surprise. Recognition. You knew him, Daniel said. He taught me this trade, I said. I spent 9 years in his shop before I opened my own. He was the kind of teacher who said things you didn't fully understand until years later and then couldn't stop thinking about. Everything I know about patience, about precision, about looking at something long enough to see what it actually is instead of what you want it to be, that came from him. Daniel was quiet. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. When he ran into serious trouble financially with the shop, I was busy with my own expansion. That's the honest version. He called twice. I listened both times, said the things you say, and did not show up. 2 years later, he was gone, and I found out through someone else, 2 weeks after the fact. I wasn't seeking absolution. I was stating the account plainly without the private softening I had allowed myself for 23 years. He talked about you, Daniel said after a moment. Not often, but when he did, he wasn't angry. He said you were the best student he'd ever had, that you'd done what people do when their own lives get loud. I set my cup down. The kitchen held the kind of silence that settles after something long overdue has finally been said. Not uncomfortable, not empty. The silence of a room that has just made space for something it needed to hold. I owe your father more than I can ever repay, I said. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He didn't tell me it was fine. He'd looked at me with steady, unhurried eyes. His father's way of seeing I understood now, and nodded once. I asked him if he wanted to stay. Not because I needed assistance. The work I had been doing for 6 months, I had done alone, and was capable of continuing alone. But there was a debt I had carried since the spring of 2002 that had never found anywhere to go. Across this kitchen table sat the only person in the world to whom any portion of that debt could be repaid. I asked him if he wanted to stay, not for me, for Henry. I woke at 5:47 on Christmas morning. The house was still dark, the kind of dark that exists for about 40 minutes in late December, before the gray begins, not light exactly, just a gradual softening of the black. I lay still for a moment listening. No sound from upstairs, no sound from the living room, which meant Daniel was either still asleep on the sofa or awake and being quiet about it. And either way, it didn't require anything from me yet. I got up, went downstairs, and started the coffee. There is something clarifying about being the first person awake in a house full of people who don't know you're watching them. The rooms look different before anyone has moved through them, more honest somehow. The living room in that early gray light was a study in what the previous night had left behind. The dinner table cleared, but the chairs not quite pushed back in. The front closet door still slightly ajar where Mitchell Hale had retrieved his coat, the small dark mark on the dining chair where a wet jacket had rested for 2 hours. Daniel was awake. He was sitting up on the sofa with the blanket across his lap and the phone in his hand, the screen casting a faint light on his face. He looked up when I came in with the 2 cups. We didn't say anything for a few minutes. Just the coffee and the early morning, and the sound of the house beginning to stir a floorboard upstairs, the old heating system ticking to life. The particular sounds of a structure that has been occupied long enough to have a routine of its own. Then Daniel said, "I went through the property records last night, after you went to bed." I looked at him. "There's a lien on the shop," he said. "Recorded 8 months ago at Multnomah County. Whitfield Gems, the building, the business license, the inventory valuation. Used as collateral on a loan of $420,000. He paused. "The signature on the application isn't yours." I held my coffee cup in both hands and looked out the back window. The yard was covered in a thin layer of overnight snow, not deep the kind Portland gets that looks definitive from inside, but starts disappearing by 10 in the morning. Margaret's rose bushes along the back fence were just visible above it, bare and angular in the gray light. 45 years. I had built that shop over 45 years, the same way you build anything that lasts slowly, carefully, without shortcuts. Paying attention to the things that most people consider too small to matter. And 8 months ago, while I was measuring my words and watching my son's eyes move across my display cases, someone had put a mortgage on it without my knowledge or consent. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the silence didn't already contain. "It's federal," Daniel said quietly. "Forging a property owner's signature on a loan application, that's not a civil matter. That's 18 U.S.C. 14 mortgage fraud. The lender was a federally insured institution, which makes it a federal offense." I nodded once. I kept looking at the yard. Noah came downstairs at 7:14, still in his pajamas hair, at an angle that suggested he had slept in a way that defied gravity. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looked at Daniel on the sofa, with the careful assessment he applied to most things, and then apparently decided that a man sleeping on your grandfather's sofa on Christmas morning was within the acceptable range of unusual. He went to the tree. I watched him go through the presents. He was methodical about it, reading the tags first, organizing by size, opening the largest ones, last in the way of a child who understands that anticipation has its own value. He said thank you for each one in the genuine way, not the performed way. He held up the drafting set I'd found at a specialty shop on Burnside. He'd mentioned wanting one once in passing. The way children mention things they don't expect anyone to remember, and looked at it for a long moment before he looked over at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Richard came down at 8:30. He was dressed, which told me he had not slept as well as he was planning to appear. He said, "Good morning to me. Good morning to Noah." Acknowledged Daniel's presence with the particular blankness of a man who has decided that the most strategic response to an uncomfortable situation is to behave as though it is a minor inconvenience rather than a significant problem. He asked if there was more coffee. I told him it was on the counter. He poured a cup and stood at the kitchen island and talked to me about Noah's school break, about a restaurant he and Sandra had been meaning to try, about the weather forecast for the rest of the week. Normal conversation assembled, with care deployed, with the practiced ease of someone who has learned that if you occupy enough of the available silence with ordinary words, it becomes harder for anything else to fill it. The folder with Whitfield Estate on the tab was gone from the kitchen table. He had taken it sometime between last night and this morning. I noted the absence the way I note most things without comment, in the part of my mind where I keep what I know separate from what I choose to show. Sandra did not come downstairs until after 11. She appeared briefly, made tea, exchanged a few words with Noah about his presence, and returned upstairs. At 12:40, while Noah and I were sitting at the kitchen table with the drafting set, trying to figure out a compass attachment that neither of us had encountered before, Sandra's phone rang from somewhere upstairs. A short ring, one, maybe 2 cycles, and then silence. She hadn't answered it, or she had answered it and ended the call almost immediately. I couldn't hear which. What I could hear about 4 minutes later was the sound of her moving across the floor above us with a different quality of step than before. Noah looked up from the compass. "Is Sandra okay?" he asked. "I think she's just tired," I said. He accepted this with the particular patience of a child who has learned that some adult explanations are placeholders rather than answers, and went back to the compass. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I went back to the compass too. That Christmas I learned something I should have already known, that quiet is not the same thing as still. That a surface with nothing visible moving on it can be covering a great deal of movement underneath. They hadn't given up. The night before had cost them Mitchell Hale and the document and the timeline they had built around it. But people who plan the way Richard and Sandra had been planning for the better part of a year do not revise their goals when a single evening goes wrong. They revise their methods. By December 27th, the cracks in their arrangement had started to show, not to them, to me. The days between Christmas and the end of the year have a particular quality in a household where something has gone wrong, but nobody is willing to say so. Everything continues, meals are made, dishes are washed, conversations happen, but the texture of it is different. Slightly off the way, a stone looks right until you hold it under proper light and the inclusions become visible. I had been holding things under proper light for 6 months. By the 27th, I could see quite a lot. The first thing I noticed was the space between them. Richard and Sandra had always moved through a room with the coordinated ease of two people who had been together long enough to have developed a shared spatial vocabulary, who sat where, who deferred on which topics, who filled silence, and who let it sit. That coordination had developed a fault line, small things individually unremarkable. Sandra choosing the chair across the room, rather than the sofa where Richard was sitting. Richard asking her a direct question, and Sandra answering it a half beat too late, the way you answer when you've been somewhere else in your head. Richard picking up her phone from the counter where she'd left it, not looking at it, just moving it, but watching her face when he did. She didn't react, which in its own way was a reaction. I noted all of it from the periphery the way I'd been noting things since July, and said nothing. The morning of the 27th, Sandra announced she was going for a walk. This was not unusual on its face. She walked regularly, had always been someone who managed her state of mind through movement. What was unusual was the timing. It was 38 degrees outside, and the sidewalk still had patches of ice from the overnight freeze. She put on her heaviest coat, and her good boots said she wouldn't be long, and left before anyone could offer to join her. I watched from the front window as she turned left at the end of the block, away from the park, which was the direction she usually walked, and moved at a pace that had a destination in it rather than the looser rhythm of someone taking the air. I didn't follow her. Daniel did. He had been in the kitchen when she left, and he was out the back door and around the side of the house within 30 seconds. With the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this kind of thing enough times that it no longer requires thought. I stayed at the window and watched the street and waited. He was back in 22 minutes. He came in through the back, poured himself the last of the morning coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table across from me. He set his phone face up between us, open to a photograph of a payphone on the corner of Northwest 19th, and Glissane, a battered metal unit outside a small grocery that had been there as long as I could remember. The kind of fixture that most people walked past without registering. Sandra had used it for 7 minutes. Daniel had photographed the number on the unit itself, a small placard near the coin slot, faded but legible. He had also photographed Sandra from across the street from a distance that kept her recognizable, but wouldn't constitute anything problematic. She'd stood with her back partly to the street, one hand braced against the top of the unit, speaking in the focused way of someone who is being careful about what they say and how. She didn't use her own phone, Daniel said, which means she didn't want the number in her call history. And she didn't use the house landline, which means she didn't want it traceable to this address. Who received the call? I said. Working on it, he said. The payphone number gives me a starting point. It's a public record, anyone can look up what number it dials out from. The question is, what's on the other end? That afternoon, Richard went into the back bedroom with his own phone and closed the door. The house is old, and the doors are solid, but the hallway carries sound in ways that the original builders probably didn't intend. I was in the kitchen when I heard his voice, not the words at first, just the tone. Lower than his normal register, and with the particular flatness that replaces inflection when someone is saying things they would prefer not to be overheard saying. I moved to the hallway, not all the way, just close enough. We need a different approach, I heard him say. He's not signing anything. That avenue is closed. A pause listening. Then, I understand that. But the old man isn't going to cooperate, and we can't wait for the court process to move at its own pace. Another pause. Just tell me what the options are. I went back to the kitchen before he finished. I didn't need to hear the rest. I'd heard the essential part, which was that Richard was still in contact with Mitchell Hale, that they were recalibrating rather than retreating, and that whatever came next was going to be something other than a document on a dinner table. That evening, Daniel ran the payphone number against a database he had access to through his PI license. The result came back around 9 o'clock. He set the printout on the coffee table between us without comment and let me read it. The number was associated with a prepaid account, the kind you load with cash and discard, which meant the trail ended there. But the payphone itself had a call history through the carrier, and the number Sandra had dialed from it resolved to a name after some cross-referencing a man in his mid-30s with a small prior record, a couple of minor citations. One charge that had been reduced and settled, nothing that would make him memorable. Nothing that would make him look from the outside like anything other than someone doing occasional work for cash. The kind of person you call when you need something done that you can't put your own name on. I read the page twice, then I set it down. Daniel folded the printout, creased it carefully along the center, and held it in both hands for a moment. Someone, he said, is thinking about doing something they can't take back. I didn't ask him to explain. He wasn't speculating, he was describing a pattern he had seen before in a professional context in the years when seeing such patterns had been his job. The details would come into focus as they developed. For now, what he had given me was the shape of the thing, not a plan yet, but the intention behind one. I didn't ask anything further. I understood. January came in quietly. Richard had been quiet for too long, which meant he was thinking. And thinking for Richard had always been more dangerous than talking. The change in him was visible from the first day of the new year, if you knew what a change in Richard looked like. He became pleasant. Not the careful, calibrated pleasantness he used when he was working towards something specific, something looser than that, more patient. He asked about the shop with what appeared to be genuine interest. He offered to help with things around the house without being prompted. He laughed at something Noah said at breakfast on the 2nd of January with a warmth that seemed for just a moment like the laugh of a man who wasn't running a calculation behind it. I watched all of this from the same distance I'd been watching everything for 6 months, and I noted it in the same notebook. And I did not mistake it for anything other than what it was, the behavior of a man who has decided to wait rather than push because pushing has stopped working. What I didn't know yet was exactly what he was waiting for. On the morning of January 4th, Richard told Sandra he had a meeting across the river and left the house at 9:15. Daniel, who had developed the habit of knowing which direction people were going before they got there, was out the back and around the block before Richard's car had cleared the driveway. I stayed home. Daniel called from a payphone. The irony was not lost on either of us 40 minutes later. "Coffee shop on Southeast Hawthorne," he said. "He's been inside with Mitchell Hale for 35 minutes. Window table, which was either careless or confident. I've been at the bus stop across the street. Can you hear anything? No. But I've got photographs. And about 8 minutes ago, Mitchell Hale opened a folder, and Richard pointed to something in it, and they talked about it for 4 minutes, and then Mitchell Hale wrote something down. It wasn't a transcript, but it was enough to confirm that the arrangement between Richard and his attorney had not concluded with Christmas Eve. Whatever Mitchell Hale had written down, it wasn't a bill for services already rendered. Daniel came back at noon. He had stopped at the county recorder's office on his way, a habit from his previous work, checking what was publicly available before drawing conclusions from what wasn't. He set 2 pages on the kitchen table. One was a photograph of Richard and Mitchell Hale at their window, table heads angled toward the same document. The other was a summary of a separate legal filing he'd found in the public record, a declaration of limited involvement signed by Richard dated December 30th, which described his role in certain family financial planning discussions as advisory only, and characterized all substantive decisions as having been made by his spouse. Sandra didn't know this document existed. I was fairly certain of that, because the Sandra I'd been watching for the past week was not behaving like a woman who had recently agreed to accept sole responsibility for anything. He's separating himself from her, Daniel said. Legally, on paper as of December 30th, he was just along for the ride. I read the filing twice. It was careful work, the kind that looks like routine administrative housekeeping, until you understand what it's positioned to do. And Sandra, I said, is still making calls she doesn't want traced, Daniel said, which means whatever she's arranging, she hasn't told Richard about it. And Richard's covering himself against whatever Sandra is arranging, which means he suspects something. He's right to, I said. Yes, Daniel said, he is. 2 days later, I took my customary afternoon rest in the armchair in the front room, a habit I'd maintained consistently since August. Because consistency in small things is what makes a performance convincing. I was not asleep. I was listening. Richard came downstairs at 2:40. He moved through the house with the particular deliberateness of someone who believes they are alone, checking rooms in a way that looked casual and wasn't. He came to the doorway of the front room, saw me in the chair with my eyes closed, and stood there for a moment. Then he went down the hallway toward the living room. I heard him move something small on the shelf beside the bookcase, the one that held a collection of framed photographs and a few pieces Margaret had picked up at a market in Santa Fe in 2009. Then he went back upstairs. Daniel found it 20 minutes later, after I'd gotten up, and mentioned in the same tone I'd used to mention that the mail had arrived, that Richard had been in the living room. Daniel ran his hand along the underside of the shelf and came up with a small rectangular device approximately the size of a book of matches, a compact voice-activated recorder, the consumer-grade kind available at any electronics retailer. He set it on the kitchen table and looked at it without touching it again. Oregon, he said. Two-party consent, I said. He nodded. Oregon Revised Statutes. 165.540, recording a private conversation without the consent of all parties is a criminal offense in this state. Richard had placed a recording device in my home, in a room where private conversations regularly occurred, without the knowledge or consent of anyone who used that room. The device he had placed to gather evidence against Sandra was itself evidence against Richard. I went to the kitchen and came back with a similar-looking object, a small, portable timer I'd had in the utility drawer for years, roughly the same dimensions, and handed it to Daniel. He placed it in the same position on the underside of the shelf, same angle, same orientation. Then he handed me the original. I took it to the bedroom and put it in the metal lockbox in the closet next to the lab results from August, and the notebook and the copy of the filing Daniel had pulled from the county recorder. In the notebook that evening, I wrote one line. January 6th R and S are no longer working together. They are working against each other. I closed the notebook. The recording device sat in the lockbox in the dark. It would become evidence eventually, as everything eventually does. Just not the kind Richard had intended to create when he pressed it into place beneath the shelf that afternoon, believing he was alone in a house that belonged to him. He had never understood, not once in 42 years, the difference between a house you live in and a house you own. It happened on a Thursday morning 3 blocks from the shop at 8:14 a.m. I know the time because I had checked my watch at the corner of Northwest 13th, and Hoyt a habit from decades of opening the shop at precisely the same hour, and noted that I was running 4 minutes ahead of my usual schedule. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of January day Portland produces occasionally between its longer stretches of gray, where the air has a sharpness to it that makes everything look slightly more defined than it actually is. I was thinking about a repair piece I'd left unfinished the evening before. I was not thinking about the alley. The alley runs between the buildings on the north side of Hoyt, a narrow service passage that the neighborhood's boutiques and restaurants use for deliveries. I had walked past it approximately 240 times a year for the better part of 4 decades. It had never required my attention before. I heard the engine before I saw the vehicle, a sudden acceleration, the sound of tires on wet asphalt, coming from the left and already moving fast by the time my body processed what my ears were telling it. I stepped back toward the building behind me, hard the way you move when you're not thinking about moving, pure reflex, the kind that doesn't consult you before it acts. The car came out of the alley at an angle, crossed the sidewalk, and struck the base of the light pole at the curb. The impact wasn't catastrophic. The vehicle was already slowing, or the pole redirected it, or both, but it was loud and immediate and left a sound in the air that took several seconds to finish. Then the car reversed, corrected, and moved away down the street at a speed that was fast enough to matter and slow enough not to draw immediate attention. I stood against the building for a moment with my hand flat on the brick. Then I straightened my coat, picked up the notebook I'd dropped without noticing I'd dropped it, and stood still while my heart did what hearts do after something like that, and gradually returned to a pace I recognized as my own. Daniel was beside me in and under a minute. He had been half a block back far enough to be unremarkable, close enough to be useful. He had his phone out and he was looking down the street in the direction the car had gone with the focused, unhurried expression of a man completing a task. "I have the plate," he said. "Good," I said. We stood there for another moment. A woman with a stroller had stopped on the opposite sidewalk and was looking at the damaged light pole with the concerned attention of a bystander who isn't sure whether to do something. I raised a hand to indicate that I was fine, which seemed to satisfy her. She moved on. "Are you actually fine?" Daniel said. "I'm 74, I said. "Everything is relative." We walked the remaining 3 blocks to the shop. I unlocked the front, put the coffee on, and sat at my workbench, while Daniel stood at the counter with his phone running the plate through a database he had access to through his license. It took 11 minutes. The registered owner was a man in his mid-30s, the same individual whose name had come up when Daniel traced the payphone number from December 27th. The connection was now direct and documented. Sandra's call, his number, his vehicle this morning. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I thought about what it meant in sequence. Sandra had discovered the recording device beneath the shelf, or rather, she had discovered the replacement. She would have noticed eventually. She was careful enough to check. When she found a device that wasn't the one she'd watched Richard place, she would have understood immediately that someone else in the house knew what Richard had done, and had decided to use that knowledge rather than confront it. She wouldn't have known whether it was me or Daniel, but she would have known that her margin had narrowed considerably, and she had responded the way a person responds when they believe their options are closing, by accelerating the one plan she had that Richard didn't know about. That evening, Daniel went to find him. I didn't ask for the details of how the conversation was arranged, or exactly how Daniel presented the situation. Those were the professional specifics of a man who had spent 11 years conducting interviews under conditions considerably more formal than a private conversation in a parking structure off Burnside. What I knew was that Daniel left the shop at 6 and came back at 9:15, and that when he came back, he sat down and told me that the man had agreed to provide a full account to federal investigators in exchange for Daniel's recommendation that his cooperation be considered in any subsequent proceeding. He was frightened, Daniel said, which is the correct response to his situation. "What did she tell him to do?" I said. I kept my voice level because some questions need to be asked in a level voice regardless of what you feel while you're asking them. "That she told him the old man walked that route every morning," Daniel said. "She told him it just needed to look like an accident. She told him there was an envelope waiting if it worked, and that she'd never met him if it didn't." I looked at the workbench in front of me. The repair piece I'd been thinking about that morning was still sitting where I had left it, a small brooch, a cameo setting that needed re-securing, nothing complicated. I picked up the appropriate tool and set it down again. "Call your contact," Daniel said. Not a question. I went to the back room and picked up the landline. The number I dialed was one I had committed to memory 15 years ago, during a period when Whitfield Gems had been involved peripherally and entirely legitimately in helping federal investigators identify a network of fraudulent estate jewelry that had been moving through the Pacific Northwest. The agent I had worked with then had since risen considerably in the organization, which was either a good sign or a complicated one, but either way his direct line still connected. He picked up on the third ring. I told him what I had. Not everything, just the architecture of it enough for him to understand the scope and the timeline and the category of offenses involved. Wire fraud, mortgage fraud, a court filing that misrepresented material facts, a documented attempt to arrange an incident involving a property owner, a cooperating witness already in hand. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "Give us 3 weeks." I said, "You have exactly that." 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to make sure there was no room left for doubt. In my work, the final stage before a piece is complete is often the most demanding. Not because the remaining steps are technically the hardest. By that point, the hardest decisions have already been made. But because the margin for error has narrowed to almost nothing, and every choice carries the weight of everything that came before it. You move slowly, you check twice. Yes, you do not rush what cannot be undone. The 18 days between January 10th and the 28th felt like that. Daniel spread everything across the work table in the back room of the shop, the one surface large enough to hold what 18 months of careful work had accumulated. I had closed early every day that week and pulled the front blinds, and in the particular quiet of Whitfield Gems, after hours we went through it piece by piece. The financial records came first. 18 months of transaction data from 4 intermediary accounts connected to Richard's property development partnership funds, moving in carefully sized increments. None large enough individually to trigger automated review, all of them tracing back with enough diligence to the same source. The total across 3 years, $380,000, moved in a pattern consistent with laundering the proceeds of wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1956. Daniel had the original account documentation, the transfer records, and a forensic summary prepared by a financial analyst he had worked with, before a woman who had spent 12 years at the IRS before moving to private practice and who Daniel said would review the numbers twice and describe them as unambiguous. The mortgage filing came next. The documents from Multnomah County, the application and the forged signature, the loan proceeds, the lien recorded against Whitfield Gems. Without my knowledge or consent, Daniel had obtained certified copies from the public record. The original signature comparison would be done by the FBI's own document examiners, but Daniel had already had a handwriting analyst review preliminary photographs. The assessment was clear. Then the trust documents. Noah's irrevocable trust had been established in 2019, funded initially with $200,000 and grown since through careful management. An irrevocable trust, as the name states, plainly cannot be modified or drawn from without the consent of the trustee in this case, a trust officer at a Portland institution who had been appointed at the time of establishment and had no record of authorizing any withdrawal. The withdrawal of $140,000 over 14 months had been authorized by a signature that was not the trustee's. Richard had needed the money and had found a way to take it that he apparently believed would go unnoticed until it no longer mattered. It had not gone unnoticed. That one, Daniel said, setting the trust file on top of the stack, is the one that will matter most to a jury. I understood what he meant. Wire fraud and money laundering are financial crimes, significant prosecutable, but abstract in the way that numbers on a page are abstract. A grandfather's trust fund for his 10-year-old grandson, drawn down by forgery over 14 months, that is not abstract. That is a story a jury can hold in their hands. The last piece of evidence was the one Richard had provided himself. The recording device he had placed beneath the shelf in my living room, the one Daniel had replaced with the timer from the utility drawer, had been running for 6 days before Richard retrieved. In those 6 days, it had captured 3 phone calls Richard had made from the living room when he believed the house was otherwise empty. One of those calls was to Mitchell Hale. In it, Richard discussed the December 30th declaration, referred to Sandra using language that described her role as primary and his as peripheral, and mentioned, in a lowered voice near the end of the call, that the situation with the old man may require a different resolution than we originally discussed. Oregon is a 2-party consent state. Recording a private conversation without consent is a criminal offense. But Richard had placed that device himself in my home without my consent, and I had done nothing more than preserve what it captured. My attorney, whom I had quietly consulted by phone in the 2nd week of January, confirmed that the recordings were usable. The device was Richard's, the placement was Richard's, and the conversation had occurred in my residence. Whatever evidentiary complications might arise, they were Richard's complications to manage. We met the FBI on the afternoon of January 25th, a Sunday, at a small commercial office suite in a building on Southwest Broadway that I suspected was used for exactly this kind of meeting and nothing else. The agent I had spoken to on the phone was there along with two others. Daniel brought the files in a document case. I brought the recording device in a sealed envelope. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Mostly they asked questions and Daniel answered them, and I answered the ones that required me. At the end, the senior agent, the one I'd spoken to 15 years ago, who looked considerably more tired than I remembered, told me they had enough. "We'll need a few days for the warrant process," he said. "Federal judge, probable cause, affidavit, the standard procedure." I said I understood. On the evening of January 29th, he called the shop's landline. The warrants had been signed. The operation was scheduled for the 31st. "We'll be outside," he said. "When you're ready, when everyone is in the room and the recording is running, turn on the porch light. We'll come in on that signal." I said I understood. After I hung up, I sat at the workbench for a while, in the quiet of the shop after closing. The streets outside were dark and wet, the way Portland streets are in January, the streetlights making the pavement shine in a way that looked like something else entirely. I reached to the shelf behind the reference books and took down the small box. I set it on the workbench and opened it and took out the rough diamond in its square of dark velvet, the stone Henry Cross had handed me in a paper bag 25 years ago, the one I had never cut, the one I had looked at many times and always put back. I held it under the bench lamp. The light moved through it in the irregular, diffuse way it moves through an uncut stone. Not the clean display of a finished piece, but something more fundamental than that. Potential held in an imperfect form, waiting for the decision to begin. I wrapped it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. The porch light. 2 days. If you've made it this far, the evidence is handed over, the warrant is signed, and George has 2 days left. Drop a comment and tell me what you think happens next. I want to know where your mind is right now. One thing before we continue the next chapter contains some fictional elements shaped for storytelling purposes. Not every detail reflects reality exactly as it happened. If that's not for you, no pressure at all, but if you're staying, I promise it's worth it. 2 days. One signal. One dinner that changes everything. I made pot roast. That detail might seem small, but it isn't. Pot roast was Margaret's recipe. 3 hours in the oven, carrots cut thick. A splash of red wine in the braising liquid that she always insisted made a difference, even though neither of us could ever identify exactly how. I hadn't made it since November 2022. Standing at the counter on the morning of January 31st, peeling carrots over the sink, I thought about that. Not about what was going to happen that evening, just about the carrots. Noah came by at noon. I'd asked him to come early, told him I needed help setting the table. He knew something was different, kids always do. But he didn't ask. He folded the napkins into rectangles the way Margaret used to, not triangles the way most people do, and placed each fork with the same deliberate care she had. When he finished, he looked at the table for a moment, then looked at me. "Do you want me to stay in my room tonight?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I'd appreciate that." He nodded. No argument, no questions. He took his plate to his room at 5 o'clock, closed the door quietly, and I didn't hear another sound from him all evening. That boy. He always understood more than I gave him credit for. Daniel had been in the house since that morning. He sat in the living room with a cup of coffee and a folder he didn't open, positioned in the armchair that faced both the hallway and the front door. He wasn't hiding. If anyone asked, he was a friend staying while his apartment was being painted. We had discussed this. Nobody would ask. Richard and Sandra arrived at 6:15. Mitchell Hale came 12 minutes later, alone carrying nothing but his coat. He looked around the room the way he always did, cataloging, assessing, and then settled into the chair at the far end of the table with the ease of a man who believed he still held some advantage. The dinner was, for a while, almost normal. I served the pot roast. I poured water. I asked Richard about a property near Lake Oswego he'd mentioned in November, and he talked about it for several minutes with the practiced fluency of someone who has rehearsed the answer many times. Sandra ate quietly, her fork moving in small, controlled motions. Mitchell Hale complimented the food twice. Both times I thanked him. By 7:30, the plates were mostly empty. I set down my fork, picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and placed it back on the table. Then I reached under my side of the table and set two things on the surface: a small recording device, the same one I had retrieved from the living room shelf 3 weeks ago, and a manila folder, thick enough to matter. The table went quiet. "Before we talk about the future," I said, keeping my voice level, "I'd like everyone to hear something first." Mitchell Hale's eyes moved to the recorder. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sandra looked at her plate. I pressed play. The first recording was from early January, a coffee shop on Southeast Hawthorne, ambient noise, underneath the kind that makes a voice carry in a particular way. Richard's voice was clear, and Mitchell Hale's was clearer. The conversation covered in practical and unhurried detail how to restructure a set of documents to place the primary liability for a series of financial decisions onto a third party. The third party was Sandra. Neither man mentioned her by name, but the framing was specific enough that no one at the table had any doubt. Sandra looked up from her plate. She looked at Richard. Richard did not look back. The recording ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it ended, I did not speak immediately. I let the silence do its work. Then I opened the folder. "These are certified copies," I said. Multnomah County Records Bank filings and an irrevocable trust document for a minor beneficiary. The trust was funded with $200,000. $140,000 of that was withdrawn 14 months ago using a signature that wasn't mine and wasn't authorized by any court. I set the folder in the center of the table. "There's also a log," I continued, "a phone number traced, a name connected to that number, and a statement signed and witnessed from the individual whose cooperation was arranged in exchange for federal consideration." I looked at Mitchell Hale directly. He had the expression of a man calculating how many exits a room has and finding fewer than he'd hoped. "The driver," Sandra said. It wasn't a question. "The driver," I confirmed. The room was silent for a long moment. The kind of silence that has weight. I stood up slowly the way a man of 74 stands up from a table, deliberately without hurrying, and said I needed to get more water from the kitchen. It was true, my glass was empty. I walked to the kitchen, filled the glass at the tap, and on my way back through the hallway, I reached over and pressed the switch beside the front door. The porch light came on. I returned to the table, set down the glass, sat back in my chair. We waited, 30 seconds perhaps less. The front door opened, not from the inside, from the outside. Two figures stepped through the threshold, their credentials already in hand, their voices calm and professional, and carrying the particular authority of people who have paperwork to support everything they are about to say. They identified themselves to the room. They explained why they were there. They were polite. They were thorough. I sat in my chair and watched. On the table between the recorder and the folder and the half-finished glasses of water, the pot roast had gone cold. Margaret always said it reheated well. They brought Richard out first. I heard the front door open from where I was still sitting at the dining table. 2 sets of footsteps on the porch, then the sound of a car door. Sandra came. A few minutes later, I didn't watch. I kept my eyes on the table, the water glasses, the recording device, the folder, the cold food no one had touched in the last hour. Mitchell Hale had already been escorted to a separate vehicle before the others, which was how these things worked when the charges involved different jurisdictions and different attorneys. The clock on the mantel read 9:47. Daniel stood in the doorway between the living room and the dining room, his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the street through the front window. He said nothing. There wasn't much to say at that point. Then I heard the stairs. Not all at once, just the second step from the top, the one that had creaked since 1987, and that I had never gotten around to fixing, because Margaret said she liked knowing when someone was coming down. One careful step, then another. Then Noah appeared at the bottom of the staircase in his socks and the gray sweater with the frayed cuff that he refused to let me replace. He looked at me. He looked at Daniel. He looked at the front door, which was now closed again, and at the absence of people who had been in the house an hour ago. Grandpa and he said, "Is it over?" I crossed the room and sat down next to him on the third step from the bottom. The wood was cold. I hadn't sat on these stairs since Noah was 4 years old and too small to navigate them alone. "The worst of it," I said. "Yes." He thought about that for a moment, the way he thought about most things thoroughly without rushing. "Okay," he said. We sat there for a while. Daniel quietly gathered his things from the living room, giving us the space without being asked. At some point, Noah leaned his head against my shoulder, and I put my arm around him, and neither of us said anything else for a long time. That was enough. Sometimes, that is exactly enough. The morning of February 1st came gray and still. My attorney's name was Patricia Wren. I had used her for business matters going back to 2009, a methodical woman who communicated in short, precise sentences and charged accordingly. She came to my house at 9 in the morning with a leather briefcase and a thermos of her own coffee, which I appreciated more than I said. We worked through the list. The first priority was the mortgage. The federal case against Richard included documented evidence of fraud in the procurement of the lien against Whitfield Gems, a forged signature, a falsified notarization, a bank record that didn't hold together under scrutiny. Patricia would file for a court order to void the deed of trust with the Multnomah County Circuit Court. She expected the process to take 6 to 8 weeks, assuming no complications. I told her to assume complications and plan accordingly. She made a note. The second matter was Noah's trust. The irrevocable trust established for his education had been drawn down by $140,000 through a forged guardian authorization. Restoring it would require a probate court, preceding a forensic accounting review and coordination with the bank. Patricia told me not to expect it to be simple. I told her I had stopped expecting things to be simple sometime around July. She almost smiled at that. The third item was the conservatorship petition Richard had filed in October. With his arrest and the pending federal charges, the petition was effectively suspended, but Patricia wanted to file a formal objection and motion to dismiss with supporting documentation, so that it could not be quietly revived by anyone acting on Richard's behalf during the legal proceedings. I agreed. We signed what needed to be signed. By noon, we had the outline of a plan. Not a resolution plans, and resolutions are different things, and Patricia was careful never to confuse them, but a direction, a set of steps in a sensible order. That was more than I'd had in August. The new space was on Northwest Thurman Street, smaller than the Pearl District location by 400 square feet, quieter by several degrees, and close enough to a good bakery that the morning air sometimes carried the smell of bread through the ventilation. I had signed the lease the week before, contingent on events I couldn't fully predict at the time. The contingency had resolved itself. I spent the afternoon of February 1st moving boxes. Not all of them I had help arrange for Thursday, but the things I wanted to carry, personally the workbench. The tools organized in their specific order. The display case with the 3 pieces I considered worth showing, and the frame photograph of Margaret and me taken outside the original shop in 1991. When the awning was new, and we were both younger than our children were now. Daniel's office was 2 doors down, 2nd floor above a used bookshop, accessible by a narrow staircase that required you to turn sideways if you were carrying anything wider than a briefcase. The sign on the door was not yet installed. He had ordered it. He told me just waiting on the engraver. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. The FBI had formally acknowledged his contribution to the case in writing a letter of commendation from the Portland field office, which Daniel had folded into thirds and placed in his desk drawer without making any particular comment about it. I knew about it because I had been listed as a corroborating reference in the case file, and Patricia had sent me the relevant pages. Henry would have been proud. Not effusively, Henry didn't do things effusively, but in that quiet, specific way he had of letting you know that something you did had landed where it was supposed to. Late in the afternoon, when the light through the new workshop window had gone, the particular shade of amber that February produces in Portland, on the rare occasions it remembers the sun exists. I sat down at my workbench for the first time in the new space. The stone was in my jacket pocket. It had been there since January 25th, The morning I went to meet the FBI and wanted something real in my hands. I took it out and set it on the leather pad. The clouded ice color, the irregular surface, the weight of 23 years of waiting, held in something no larger than a question. You'll know when Henry had said, when you look at it properly. I looked at it properly. I opened the tool case on my right, selected the scaife, adjusted the angle twice, checked the light, and checked the angle again. Behind me, the new space was quiet in the way a workshop is quiet when it is waiting to become itself, holding its breath, not yet sure what kind of place it would turn out to be. I had some ideas. I positioned the stone. The first cut is always the one that decides everything, the angle, the direction, the acknowledgement that you have understood what the stone was always trying to be. You can hesitate for 23 years, but eventually you have to commit. I made the cut. The stone was imperfect. It would always be imperfect. That was the nature of things that are real, rather than things that are merely ideal. There would be inclusions, asymmetries, places where the light scattered in directions no calculation could fully predict. But it was real. And in my experience, 50 years of it, sitting in the same chair, looking at what other people missed, that is almost always enough. I'm 74 years old. I've spent half a century in the same chair, at the same workbench, looking at stones that most people would walk right past. I built a skill out of seeing what others missed, the hidden fracture, the false clarity, the inclusion buried so deep, you almost convince yourself it isn't there. And somehow, I almost missed it in my own home. That's the part that stays with me long after everything else is settled. Not the legal proceedings, not the documents. Not even the moment the front door opened from the outside. What stays with me is July, a cup of tea. I didn't finish a question asked too smoothly, a look in my son's eyes that I recognized and then talked myself out of recognizing. The warning was there. I saw it. I just told myself I needed more time, more certainty, more proof before I had the right to believe what I already knew. Don't be like me. If this family story teaches you anything, let it be this. The people who mean to take something from you rarely arrive with their intentions printed on their face. They arrive with kindness. They arrive with concern. They use words like planning and care and the future, and they say them in the same warm tone you've heard your whole life, which is exactly what makes it so difficult to hear what they actually mean. Pay attention earlier than I did. Trust the instinct that tells you something is off, even when you can't yet explain why. Gather your evidence quietly. And when the time comes, and it will come, be ready. This was never about anger for me. I want to be honest about that. This dad revenge story wasn't built on rage or bitterness, or any desire to see anyone suffer. It was built on patience, on precision, on the same discipline I applied to every stone I ever cut. You don't force the line, you find it, and then you commit. That's what I did. I waited until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. And then I acted with everything I had. I believe God doesn't allow things to stay hidden forever. What is done in the dark has a way of stepping into the light. Not always on our timeline, not always in the way we imagined, but it happens. I've lived long enough to know that. And I've lived long enough to know that the truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. I never wanted this to be my family's story. I wanted my son to be someone I could trust. I wanted my grandson to grow up without having to understand what betrayal looks like. I wanted Margaret to still be here, sitting in the chair by the window, telling me I was overthinking it. But this is the story I was given, and I chose to carry it with both hands carefully, steadily, the way you carry something that matters. Noah still comes to the shop after school. He still sits in the same small chair in the corner. And last Tuesday he looked up from his sketchbook and said, without any particular context, "Grandpa, I think you're pretty good at your job." I told him I was still learning. That's the closest thing to peace I know. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the final page. It means more than I can say. Now, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me if you were in George's position, would you have waited? Or would you have acted sooner? What would you have done differently? Every perspective matters, and I genuinely read what you share. If this dad revenge journey resonated with you, if it made you feel something real, consider hitting subscribe so you're there when the next story begins. There's always another diamond waiting to be found. One honest note before you go. While this story draws from authentic human experiences surrounding betrayal, family story dynamics, and the quiet strength it takes to face injustice, certain details and scenes have been shaped for storytelling. If this isn't the kind of content that speaks to you, that's completely okay. Explore what does. But if it did speak to you, I hope it said something worth hearing.